By the mid-1950s, the Soviet Air Force had a training problem, and it was killing people. Student pilots were learning the basics in slow piston trainers like the Yak-18, and from there, they were climbing straight into the two-seat MiG-15 UTI. Think about that jump for a minute. One week a kid is puttering around the pattern behind a little radial engine, and the next he's strapped to a swept wing jet chasing 600 miles an hour. And almost nothing he learned in the first airplane carries over to the second. The handling was different, the energy was different, the whole sight picture was different, and the accident report stacked up accordingly. Fatal training crashes became a routine cost of doing business, and every cadet they buried was a frontline pilot the squadrons would never get. What the Soviets needed was a dedicated jet trainer built for all through training. One airplane that could take a student from his very first flight clear through intermediate work and weapons familiarization, so that by the time he moved up to his combat type, flying a jet was already second nature. The Soviet Air Force wrote a requirement along those lines in the mid to late 1950s, and over time it grew into something bigger. A search for a single jet trainer that every Air Force in the Eastern Bloc could standardize on. Now, the airplane that ended up answering that call took shape a long way from any Soviet design bureau. The Czechoslovaks were flying the same Yaks and the same two-seat MiGs, and they were burying cadets for the same reasons. But unlike most of the smaller Warsaw Pact states, they had the industry to do something about it, because Aero had been building airplanes since just after the First World War. So around the same time Moscow was writing its requirement, the Czechoslovak Air Force had been cooking up its own requirement for an all-through jet trainer, and that work turned into a venture between engineers at the VZLU Aviation Research Institute and the manufacturer Aero Vodachody. Two designers, Zdeněk Rublich and Karel Thomas, laid down the original concept, and when both men retired before the job was finished, an engineer named Jan Vulček carried the design across the line. Their philosophy stayed simple and stubborn the whole way through. Build an airplane that's easy to fly, hard to break, and cheap enough to turn out by the thousand. The prototype, called the XL-29, came together in the spring of 1959, and you can read that philosophy right off the airframe. The wings were mid-mounted and dead straight, which kept the airplane stable and honest, kept production simple, and left room in the wing roots for the intakes feeding a single engine buried back in the tail. Slotted flaps handled takeoff and landing. The ailerons carried aerodynamic balancing, so a student didn't need forearms like a blacksmith to roll it. And the landing gear was built stout enough to shrug off the kind of arrivals that student pilots specialize in, and to do it off grass, sand, and plain dirt, because plenty of Eastern Bloc flight schools weren't sitting on smooth concrete. The two cockpits sat in tandem under separate canopies, with the instructor perched a touch higher in back so he could see over his student. And both seats were ejection seats, linked to fire together, so the two of them could never collide on the way out. The standout feature, though, sat up top. The L-29 carried a T-tail with the horizontal stabilizer perched high above the wing's wake, and on a trainer that placement earns its keep. In a spin, the elevator stays in clean air and keeps its authority, and since the horizontal surfaces sit above the rudder instead of ahead of it, the rudder keeps breathing clean air too, which makes spin recovery a whole lot more forgiving, and loss of control was the single biggest killer of young pilots in training. Now, T-tails come with a known bill attached. Haul the nose up far enough at speed, and the wing's wake can blanket that high stabilizer and set up a deep stall that's ugly to get out of, which is why you don't see many hard maneuvering fighters wearing one. But a basic trainer flying its intended envelope lives nowhere near that corner of the chart, so Aero took the benefit and kept the tail. Maintenance got the same level of thought. The skin was covered in quick access panels, and the whole rear fuselage was built to split off behind the wing and roll away on a special trolley, leaving the engine sitting out in the open for the mechanics. A trick borrowed straight from the two-seat MiG-15s the Soviets were already flying. That one decision turned an engine change from a hangar project into a routine job. And that engine sitting out on its trolley deserves a story of its own, because it amounts to a little declaration of independence. The Czechoslovaks had no appetite for depending on Soviet-licensed turbojets, so they brought in the engine maker Motorlet to build a domestic power plant designed around this trainer from the start. The result was the M701, a single-stage centrifugal flow turbojet putting out just shy of 2,000 pounds of thrust, and it ran for the first time in 1958. It wasn't going to be ready when the airframe was, though, so the XL-29 made its maiden flight on the 5th of April 1959 behind a British engine, the Bristol Siddeley Viper. The next flying prototype carried the Viper as well, but in July of 1960, the third prototype flew behind the M701, and from that day forward, the airplane flew on Czechoslovak power and nothing else. It was around this same stretch that it picked up the nickname Delfin, the Dolphin. And one look at that rounded nose from the right angle tells you exactly why it stuck. With its intended engine finally installed, testing picked up in a hurry because Moscow had announced a competition to select the next trainer for the entire Eastern Bloc, and Aero had been invited to bring its prototype. Flight test went smoothly on the whole, with a couple of honest fixes along the way. The air brakes got perforation holes drilled in to cure a nasty vibration when they deployed, and the pitot tube moved from the tail out to the wing after it fed the gauges bad numbers during hard maneuvering. In 1961, the third prototype flew to the Monino Airfield outside Moscow and went into a grueling 2-month evaluation against its two rivals, the Soviet-built Yakovlev Yak-30 and the Polish-built PZL TS-11 Iskra. A commission with representatives from all three nations ran the trials, headed by a Soviet lieutenant general named Matveyev, and they measured everything a trainer could be measured on: performance, handling, technical complexity, cockpit ergonomics, ease of maintenance, how long an engine change took, and how each airplane held up working off rough dirt strips. The story goes that these three prototypes got a harder look than the MiG-21 did during its own evaluation, and that tracks because this decision was going to shape the training of most of the Eastern Bloc's fighter pilots for a generation. The Yak-30 washed out early. It flew more like a racer than a trainer, and it lacked the balanced, forgiving manners the job demanded. That left the Delfin and the Iskra, and depending on which sources you read, each one clearly outperformed the other, which mostly tells you it was close. What tipped it was everything surrounding the flying. The L-29 ran the whole 2 months without a single failure, while both of its rivals broke down with serious problems along the way. It was judged easier to maintain and cheaper to build, and it posted the lowest stall speed, the lowest landing speed, and the shortest runs off unpaved strips. There was even an endurance exercise where each airplane flew continuous 5-minute training circuits on one tank of fuel. Touch and go after touch and go without ever stopping, and the Delfin logged 15 circuits while the other two managed 10. And for a schoolhouse airplane, numbers like those matter more than any top speed figure. The commission's verdict named the L-29 the most suitable machine for the job. But underneath the flight test data, there was a political engine driving the outcome. The whole point of the program was to knit the aviation industries of the Comecon nations together, and to keep Czechoslovakia's factories from going idle. It had already been decided that Czech plants would build the winning trainer no matter whose drawing board it came from. Picking the L-29 kept those lines warm for years and meant production could start almost immediately, since Aero was already tooled up for its own airplane. Whichever design won, it was getting built in Czechoslovakia, so they picked the one already standing in a Czechoslovak factory. The Poles did not take it well. Warsaw rejected the commission's verdict outright and put the TS-11 Iskra into service with its own air force anyway, partly to save money and partly to keep its own aviation industry breathing, and every other Warsaw Pact air force fell in line behind the L-29. What followed was the largest aircraft production program ever run in any Comecon nation outside the Soviet Union. Full production kicked off in April of 1963 and ran for 11 years, and by the time the line closed, Aero had turned out 3,665 Delfins across 42 production batches, folding in more than 45 modifications as the airplane matured. The little M701 became a giant program in its own right. With over 9,000 engines built, and at least 5,000 of them going purely to feed L-29 production and spares. To this day, the L-29 stands as the most produced dedicated military jet trainer in history. The Lockheed T-33 was built in greater numbers, but that airplane started life as an F-80 shooting star with a second seat grafted in. So the clean sheet title stays with the Delfin. And beyond the Warsaw Pact, the airplane sold all over the map, flying with Egypt, Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Indonesia, Nigeria, and Uganda, among others. Most of those were standard two-seat trainers, with a couple of exceptions. The L-29A Acrobat was a single-seat aerobatic version, a pet project by Aero engineers who wanted to see how far the airframe could be pushed, and only 2 were ever built, spending their careers touring engineering fairs and wowing Western crowds at the 1969 Paris Air Show. The only true operational subvariant was the L-29R, a tactical reconnaissance version that traded the rear cockpit for a container full of downward-facing cameras. The paper trail on that one gets murky, because some records say the project died in 1965, while Czech documentation points to a small series built inside the 18th production batch, with solid evidence that a batch went to Egypt. But the variants were a sideshow next to the day job. In service, the Delfin earned the kind of reputation trainers dream about. The Soviet Air Force was the biggest operator by far, taking roughly 2,000 of them to replace its aging trainers and its two-seat MiG-15s. And that purchase did exactly what the whole program had been invented to do, because with the Delfin on the ramp, a cadet flew jets from his very first lesson to his last, and the deadly leap from a piston trainer straight into a MiG was gone. And the pilots who flew it reached for car analogies to explain the difference. The Delfin handled like a smooth Volga sedan, they said, while the old Yak-18 was a crude little Moskvich, and the MiG-15 was a Pobeda. Instructors praised it as forgiving and docile, an airplane that would soak up student mistakes that would have been fatal in twitchier metal, and the numbers back up the feel. Because with the flaps hanging out, this jet stalls at around 70 knots, which is piston single territory. Over in Czechoslovak service, the airplane picked up the nickname the Flying Pram on account of the comfort and security it gave instructors while their babies made their first wobbly ventures into the sky, and a cadet could typically be ready for his first solo after around 13 hours of duel. The Delfin's whole job was keeping green kids alive long enough to become fighter pilots, and it did that job about as well as any airplane ever built. As tends to happen with a cheap jet available in numbers, the Delfin eventually got handed work it was never designed for. The hard points under the wings had been there all along, put there so cadets could learn the basics of dropping a bomb and firing a rocket, but a rack that carries a practice store carries a live one just fine. It could haul gun pods, rockets, and a pair of small bombs on those 2 stations. And Egyptian L-29s flew strike missions against Israeli ground forces during the Yom Kippur War, while the type also saw action in the Nigerian Civil War. But the ceiling on that career showed up hard in the First Nagorno-Karabakh War, where Azeri forces lost at least 14 of their 18 Delfins to Armenian air defenses. Slow, unarmored, and built to teach rather than to fight, it only ever succeeded in combat, where friendly airplanes already owned the sky above it. A trainer wearing bomb racks is still a trainer. Long before that lesson got written over the Caucasus, though, the Delfin's replacement was already rolling out of the same factory. By the early 1970s, Aero's own L-39 Albatross was taking over the line, and Delfin production wound down in 1974, but the airplane didn't go quietly. It hung on in military service for decades, often flying right alongside its replacement, and a few were still carried on active military registers as late as the early 2020s. And when the Cold War ended, the survivors found a second life. Large numbers passed into private hands, where the same virtues that made it a good military schoolhouse, simple handling, sturdy bones, and easy wrenching, made it one of the most popular jet warbirds money can buy. Delfins still work the airshow circuit today. A pair of them ran first and second in the jet class at the Reno Air Races in 2008. Some of those racers running the very same British Viper. The first prototype flew behind back in 1959, and in 2007, an unmodified L-29 flew the world's first jet flight powered purely by biodiesel, running from Reno all the way to Florida. 3 more are still earning a living with American universities as high-dynamic flight research aircraft. That's some 65 years after the type entered service. And for an airplane designed to forgive the mistakes of teenagers, still pulling honest work 6 decades on is about the finest compliment this industry knows how to pay. So that's it for today's video. If you got something out of this one, do me a favor and tap that like button, subscribe if you're new here, and ring the notification bell while you're at it, because it truly goes a long way for us.